Hello, James.
Hello. Hi, how you doing?
Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you fine, yeah. An absolutely lovely background as well.
Oh, designed it specially for this moment.
Well, it's worked.
So shall we? Um, I guess just to start off with, first of all, our first Sourced Presents webinar will be for everybody's benefit running these every week. And you'll get to meet all of the team members at Sourced over the coming next few months. They'll be spending time doing half-an-hour sessions with a whole host of different people, all within tech, in different roles, different responsibilities, and at different levels as well. So hopefully, content that's interesting for a wide range of people, whether you're getting into tech or already in it, and no matter what the function is. So that Source Presents. For those who don't know Source as a business, we work with scaling software companies across Europe and help them to build their go-to-market teams. And Relative Insight are one of those companies that we've helped to support over the last few years. James Cuthbertson, CRO, is an old friend, and having worked together in recruitment originally, and then very successfully has now spent in two different companies building out teams and launching in the US, and is going to share some of his pearls of wisdom today. So, James, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, no, delighted to be talking about this topic. It's one of those things, launching for British and European businesses, like launching in the States, is just one of these things that I feel like everyone has either had a go at, done successfully or not. Everyone seems to have an opinion on, and that's definitely what I'm going to be sharing today, like my opinions. So hopefully they can be useful for people, but it's no more than my view on things, because it is a very much like a subjective topic, how you go about launching in the States. And the other caveat, Lloyd, is to say that I think the advice that I'm going to give applies to leadership in tech businesses or adjacent businesses that are probably like doing between 0 and 5 million ARR, and maybe have a team of under 100 people. I think that if it's bigger than that, then I'm not sure that this advice is completely relevant. It might be interesting, but it might not be directly relevant.
I think what's interesting about these topics as we run through them week on week is we're really keen to try and make sure that we talk to people who really honestly do share their viewpoint, rather than, I think lots of people have been to events and maybe heard people talk quite generically about topics without any kind of really meaningful insight into what they've experienced from an honest perspective. So yeah, looking forward to it. Maybe you could give us a bit of background on you and where you've been and what you've done so far, and then we'll get into the detail.
Yeah, great. So if I just cover my story quickly,
Yeah.
And then I'll get on to the topic at hand. So as you mentioned, I started out post-university in sales recruitment, placing sales and account management people into the first wave of London's kind of BI and sort of analytics scene. So you think sort of the data monitors, Factiva, Thomson Reuters of this world, that were the kind of forefathers for this plethora of analytics companies that came after. And then met Fran and the team that were starting to do interesting things with social data over at Pulsar, which was then part of the Cello group. Jumped over and sort of started out Pulsar with Francesco, and we scaled that business from being just the two of us in a stationary cupboard to being a couple of hundred people across 3 offices. And that business then was acquired by Access Intelligence, which owned Vulio and a couple of other brands in media monitoring. So a success story with a small s, I'd say, for a number of different reasons. But growing a tech business inside an agency group is definitely not for the faint-hearted. So that was fascinating, and an amazing learning journey. And then met Ben Hookway, who was CEO of Relative Insight, and he'd been helping our founders, James and Phil, bring this text analytics tool that we have out of its roots in academia at Lancaster University, and had started to talk to the world about how to capture the power of text, especially in marketing and the insight sector, which I knew a bunch about. So jumped over and helped bring that business from, again, 0 revenue to where we are about now, which is, around the sort of 6 million ARR with teams in London, Lancaster, and also in Philadelphia, which I'm going to be talking about a bunch during this webinar. So yeah, that's the story so far in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. And I know that the broom cupboard part is true, because I saw the broom cupboard and it was indeed a broom cupboard.
It really was, yeah.
Great. Well, look, let's get into it, and it's good to get that background on where you've been. I guess all things US, when you look at kind of some of the biggest bits of advice that you maybe wish you'd been given or that you could share, what would be kind of like the key findings that you think that you've seen over the last, or the experiences that you've had so far doing it?
Yeah. So I would divide the advice I'm going to give into 2 different buckets. The first bucket would be about like how to think about the challenge or the problem, the things to consider, and the things that you need to do to ready your organization. And then the other bucket would be like tactically, like what do you actually need to do? What do you actually need to spend your time on in order for it to be a success? Like the actual like little cheats and little hacks. Yeah. So if we start with and just to be clear, I've got this wrong once at Pulsar, like absolutely wrong. And there were some great moments and we had some wonderful people and stuff like that. But I would say that like we generally got it wrong. We then did rectify it. And then I think that we've definitely got it right at Relative Insight. And that's only through learnings. And I wish I could have watched a podcast like this with someone who'd basically gone and made the mistakes so that I could learn from them. So things to consider. So like the famous saying goes like 2 nations separated by a common language, which is like the jokey thing to say that we all sound the same a bit, speak the same language, but we're very different. I think that cannot be underestimated. I absolutely love America. I spend loads of time over there, work and vacation time. And I think that the thing to understand as a European or British leader is that you mustn't underestimate the differences in culture between your home team, like the team in your home office, be that in London or Manchester or Paris, Tel Aviv, wherever it is you're based, and the team that you're going to be creating stateside. I think that's the first thing that like a lot of people underestimate. They don't invest the time in understanding what your American team are going to want from you and how they want to be interacted with and what they're interested in and what makes them tick and what their family lives look like and all those kind of like softer things that actually allow you to be an effective partner to them, an effective leader. Because if you just attempt to pick up your London culture or your Manchester culture and dump it into a city in America, it will fail and it will fail fast, regardless of the amount of money and time and effort you spend on it. And I think that you speak to umpteen American candidates that say, oh, I've worked for a French business before, or I've worked for an Israeli business before, and they just really didn't get us. And they were so completely different to us and they didn't invest in time in learning about like us and our culture. So that's like a big thing. Does that make sense, that first one?
Yeah, so the people element, the actual really understanding the nuances of the people in America.
Totally.
Yeah,
totally. Okay. And I think that like, that's the first thing. Then the second thing is that America's a big old place, right? So the difference in the cultures and the types of people and the working practices and the working environment that you need to create on the West Coast or in mountain time or on the East Coast is going to be vastly different. And I think that, like, I'm sure that some of my team in Philly will watch this, like even the cultural difference between a Manhattan-based New York team and a Philadelphia-based team, like that is a big gulf in culture and the way that they want to live their lives and the way they want to be spoken to and the way they want to interact with you, like it's different. Like it's a different thing and it's a different vibe. And I think that, again, underestimate that at your peril. In my opinion, and that's when I got that wrong the first time round. You know, I thought when we were doing Pulsar, I was like, we've got this incredible culture in London, we've got this like really sort of like vibrant thing that we've got going, and it was very, very British. I learned later. I tried to pick it up, put it into New York in a WeWork, and it just didn't translate. It just didn't translate. And I think that that's the thing that we've been more sensitive to the second time round at Relative Insight.
And so when it comes to that location piece, how do you decide?
Yeah. So this is like the do's and don'ts, right? So
Yeah.
moving over from the kind of like things
Yeah,
to think
we'll flip
about and the
between
things
both.
to do. Yeah, yeah. Like, so the thing, I would say that what tends to happen. So if we talk about we call it the Chad problem at Relative. It's a bit of a joke, and what we mean is that what happens is that often British or European tech businesses will say, I want to go and get a piece of the American market. I want to launch in America for obvious reasons. Huge opportunity there. Average order values are bigger. Maybe buying cycles are a bit more progressive. People are willing to try new things. So they say, I want a piece of that action. So what I need to do is I need to go and find myself a really senior individual contributor salesperson who's probably going to be based in one of the most expensive cities in the world, either New York or LA or San Francisco. And once I've found Chad, I'm going to then dump him into a WeWork or even allow him to work remotely. Chad is going to cost us an enormous amount of money from a salary point of view that is going to be a big drain on our business. And we're going to expect Chad, bless him, to move mountains for us in year one. We're going to expect him to do 2 million quid compared to £1 million that our top performer is doing in London. And it simply is not going to happen. Like it's simply not going to happen, because that individual, regardless of what they did at Oracle, NetSuite, or what they did at Brandwatch, or whatever big logo you're attempting to get them from, like those are just some examples that might be relevant for us. That person is still going to need a great deal of training and support. They're going to need to feel part of the culture. They're going to need contact with leadership. They're going to need to be involved in projects that aren't just new business selling. If they are doing big ticket deals, they're going to need deal teams around them. And all of those people are going to be based over in Europe. And that doesn't tend to work. I very rarely seen it work. And so what happens is that people bring that hire in. They have sort of a honeymoon period of 3 or 4 months where they might get them over to the UK and cover them in sort of love and go out and have drinks and dinner with them and all that stuff. They go back to the US and it goes cold very quickly, and it all ends before the year's out, right? And you've spent a great deal of money on something that was never going to work. So I would say that that's probably the biggest pitfall. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question there. I actually talked about something else, but like that's like the biggest pitfall. And so what I think is important is to understand that in order for a US team to work, that it needs to be exactly that, a US team. So you need to have different people in different roles that can rally around one another and support one another, that feel attached to the main business, although they are going to always be like a smaller team to start with, and that you invest in creating a kind of home environment for them, with an office, with proper guidance, connecting them to like the main business. So that's really, really important. And I think that's what we've done at Relative the second time around. You know, we selected Philadelphia for cultural reasons. It's a culture that aligns, the city of Philadelphia, the culture that exists there aligns really closely to the culture that we have at Relative. And I think that there are different cities that would maybe align to different businesses' cultures. You know, people think about Toronto, Chicago, Boston, New York, for example. But each of those cities, it comes with its own distinct cultural footprint, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Often when speaking to other people in that position, I think that there's a kind of broad strokes approach applied to American cities are like this. But then if you think about the UK and how different London is to Manchester, to Liverpool, to Birmingham, they're all uniquely very different, and that's in a very small country. So yeah, that makes complete sense. I'm interested to understand, in terms of planning to make that approach into America within both companies, was that always discussed at the very beginning? Was it always, we will go to America? And when did you have a point where you knew you would be ready to go? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that, yes, in both businesses, there was a sense of inevitability because we delivered a certain amount of revenue from the UK because of it being like MarTech, Insights Tech, Res Tech, whichever you want to call it. The big action is always stateside. So there was a sense of inevitability there. And I think that you kind of have to earn the right to go, right? So you have to have delivered some US sales, and you have to have delivered a little bit of a footprint in America before you can then turn up. Because I think, again, another pitfall is if you had no US customers, no previous with US businesses, and you just turned up, I think that would also be a major pitfall. So I'd say build a book of US business before you actually make this move. So yes, there was a plan. And I think the one thing,
Yeah.
a phrase that I'll steal from one of our investors is this idea of like limping in. Don't limp into the States. It's a big market. There's a big opportunity there. So you need to think about it as a big thing within your organization.
Yeah.
And so when I say, wasting money on the Chad problem, I don't mean you can save your way to a US success. You absolutely can't. You have to invest in proper people, proper salaries, proper office, proper culture. And if you go in with like, okay, we're going to have one or two people based in, like a random WeWork, it's too fragile and it's too feeble. And what you'll end up doing is finding that can then very quickly get eroded back down to zero and you're at square one. So this idea of limping in is also another thing to avoid. It's a big opportunity, so you have to deal with it like it's a big opportunity and be ready to do that. So maybe hold back if it requires saving for a particular investment case, ring fencing money to do it. Go do that. Don't go early and limp in, because you'll just get your ass handed to you. Excuse my French.
I like that. We've got a good headline quote for this after as well. Don't limp in. I like that a lot. So you talked about trying to establish a footprint in the US before you go. How did you do that?
Yeah. So pure and simple in our industry anyway, it's events and trade shows. So the very best and the most lucrative and most progressive events and trade shows are stateside in marketing and insights. And so that's the likes of IIEX, TMRE, Quirks, just to name a few.
Yeah.
And so people in my industry will know those, but people outside of my industry, there will be equivalents. And they tend to be these 2 or 3 day events that do take investment. But by going over there, we were able to generate significant numbers of US customers by sending the UK team, which we then followed up with a performance marketing plan, and then some of our sales and account management team working US hours. So I think that like the bridgehead was the events, followed by some solid performance marketing, and then getting people to work US hours. And very quickly we were able to build, tens of US customers without like a domestic presence there, which then became really important later.
That makes sense, because I remember certainly from Pulsar days, there were some hires. We did some work hiring for specific UK-based US salespeople, but I think maybe what I'm hearing is that you were using the learning from that is to take your maybe more experienced UK salespeople who already know the product and the business and get them to sell in the US market first. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just to say, hey, like person in the team, you're doing great, I want you to start working US hours and selling to US businesses, like that's a bit blunt and it's a bit clumsy. So what you want to do is you want to say, hey, high performing person, let's get you on a plane to Chicago for this particular trade show that we know is going to be a really prospect rich environment. Let's build you a pipeline off the back of 2 or 3 of those events. They then close out some business, and then you can follow it up with performance marketing and getting that person to work US hours, because they've seen that there's actually a reward there for them. Sure. I think if you just get people doing demand gen, cold demand gen in US hours, that can be quite demoralizing because they haven't seen it work, if that makes sense.
Absolutely does. It absolutely does. Cool. Thank you. In terms of other bits of advice, things that maybe we've talked a lot about, the things that haven't worked and then have worked. What things have you this time round really nailed?
I think that obviously everyone is struggling with the slightly more challenging economic times, and so I think that our travel and stuff like that has been curtailed slightly in the first half of this year. But up until that point, I think the other thing to say is like you're going to need to, as a leader, if you want to have a US team, you need to be prepared to get on a plane. You need to be prepared to go see them, and you don't understand how valuable that is until you see, the outcome from your visit. That just lifts people. And so whether you divvy that up across the leadership team or one person takes that on who likes that travel, I think that's one thing that's really important. So if you're going to have a US team, you need senior people to get over there and either move someone or divvy it up and get on a plane and get over and see them like regularly. So I think that the idea that you can set it up and then run it with remote like communication tools like Slack and Teams and stuff like that, I think that's also a big mistake as well. And even when times are hard, like economically, I think that you still need to prioritize it. So our CEO is going to see our Philadelphia team next month, for example, even though we're doing reasonably limited amount of travel at the moment. So I think we're still prioritizing it.
Yeah. So again, it's that strong human element to it rather than just having a kind of detached, almost satellite offering.
Yeah, agreed. And to be honest, like what we're talking about here is like commercial teams. I think if we were talking about developers or if we were talking about like operational staff, it may be different, and I can't really comment on that. I'm just commenting specifically on commercial teams and commercial talent.
It's a good point. Good point. On that perspective, what have you experienced from a leadership of managing and leading, ultimately being responsible for US commercial teams versus the UK? Are there things that stand out as being different, or is it pretty much the same? You have a quota, you hit your quota, etc., or anything that surprised you?
I think the one thing that the European and British leaders have got to get their head around is that the way that salaries and cost of living works in the States is just different, and you shouldn't attempt to compare them. I think that's one thing that I see British leadership fall foul of. They try and compare what a graduate might be earning in LA to what a graduate might be earning in London, or they might compare what a sales leader might be earning in Denver to what the sales leader might be earning in Manchester. And those two things are just not comparable. They're not apples with apples. So I'd say that's probably the one big thing that stands out. Like, really try and get your head around the fact that like those two things are just not comparable, and you shouldn't attempt to compare them.
I remember working on the first US roles that we worked on a few years ago and speaking to graduates with a year in New York, and they were asking for almost a 6-figure basic salary, and speaking to a client at the time and saying this is what they need, and they just could not get their head around it at all because they hadn't done the due diligence and really kind of thought about it. And then that same candidate, I remember this one conversation, that same candidate saying, can I just explain to you how much it costs for me to rent somewhere to live in New York, and how much it costs for me to do anything in New York? And then the picture became clearer. So
exactly. And I think, again, if you want the cachet and you want to be in the same city as your customers and the same city as your industry center. So if you want to be in San Fran, or if you want to be in New York, for example, the cost of living is incredibly high. And so, you have to accept the salary price tag comes with that. Yeah. Whereas if you are happy to be in a city that isn't, maybe the cost of living isn't so sort of extremely high, then the salaries, coincide with that. And so that should also play into your decision-making process when you're deciding where you want your US HQ to be.
Makes sense. Makes complete sense. Thank you. Anything else you can think of? Any other bits of advice? I feel like we've covered quite a lot in a short space of time, but is there anything else that, when we talked about this subject originally and discussing it, have we missed anything?
No, I think that's most of it, to be honest. Like, if you think about the final thing I would say is like, if you're leading leaders, which I do at the moment, a relative, you need to make sure that they are remembering to keep their remote teams, or not remote teams, but the teams that are not physically with them in the office, front of mind. So when they're doing like communication, or if they're doing training, or if they're doing socials even, try and make sure that an equivalents are taking place in the States.
Okay.
Or you're able to do your team meetings at PM, so that you've got your US reps are able to attend. So like, for example, we've got a great guy called Colin, and we have loads of great people in the States, but he recently graduated up into a revenue generating role, and we moved the entire pipeline meeting to be PM on a Monday so that Colin could join. And that sounds like a small thing, but it's actually not, because it means that every Monday, like, our US rep is actually involved in the pipeline meeting as
Sure.
opposed to just seeing notes from it. And it's stuff like that, the small things that just require a bit of consideration that you should do.
One last question on that point to an extent. How do you find it is managing and building relations between UK and US counterparts maybe doing the same role? Like, how do you spend time trying to facilitate them speaking a lot and learning from each other, or is it pointless to an extent?
Sorry, Lloyd. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. It's super important, you know, as you probably allude to. And the only way is if you really try. It'll only happen if you really try. So our VP of Enablement, Ailey, for example, was a big part of helping us set Philadelphia up. She was fantastic. She was a great partner in that. And she put a great deal of effort into building a relationship with her equivalent, Kim. And because, you know, they're different time zones, they're halfway across the world, and it's not just going to happen. You have to really try, and they nailed it. So it is really important. The business will benefit from it, but it doesn't come easy. You know, it's a big effort.
Got it. Thank you.
No probs. It's been really enjoyable. Hopefully there's been some useful pearls of wisdom there.
Well, I hope so. I think, as I said at the beginning, the purpose of these is to get true insight and honesty around, you know, people admitting to where things went wrong or how they got things wrong and how they learned from those, and some meaningful, tangible points that they can take. And I think, as you mentioned, it is important to reference this has been mainly in building commercial teams, but I think some of the points that you've raised do apply to teams outside your product marketing, etc. as well. So no, thank you. Really good half an hour. I'm sure for anybody kind of listening in, if you want to reach out to James and connect with him on LinkedIn, you can, and he'll be able to follow up. And he's a pretty social guy, so yeah, be happy to jump on a call or meet you. But no, thank you, mate. Really appreciate it. First episode of Source Presents done, and tune in for next week.
Thanks very much.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye.